This video will explore just some of the facts which lend themselves as signs that the attacks of September the 11th, 2001 were an inside job. We begin here by considering evidence that explosives were inside the buildings before their collapses, in the categories of eyewitnesses, chemistry, and physics. Fact: these firemen reported experiencing an explosion inside the towers.
What happened?
It was an explosion. We was in the lobby, and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like? What was it like?
Horrible. It's horrible.
You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the planet probably?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion. But we was inside waiting to go upstairs, and on the way upstairs, the whole thing blew. And we just collapsed on everybody inside the lobby.
Similar to the first tower coming down, secondary?
I don't know about the first one, but I know the second it was terrible. Then there was a third one too after that one.
Third explosion after that?
Yes, sir. Everybody was inside the building waiting to go upstairs.
So what you told me is that there was a plane or whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
It was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building.
Since these are first-hand accounts, we are warranted in believing them. Fact: this policeman reported hearing explosions around the time of Building 7's collapse.
And I started running, and the whole time you're hearing boom, 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 boom. I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
And this first responder even reported hearing a countdown over the radio before those explosions.
The Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building, they just said bringing a building down. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions.
This volume of first-hand testimony is a sign that there were in fact explosions being experienced in those towers before their collapses. Fact: even long after both towers had collapsed, at 5:20 that afternoon, this reporter's microphone also picked up a series of explosive sounds just seconds before Building 7's collapse. While her location was where the sound would have been largely absorbed and deflected before reaching her microphone, and while the recording levels were set only for a human voice merely a few inches away, distinct booming sounds can still be heard by simply emphasizing the bass frequencies.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here?
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
If you didn't hear it, please back up and listen again. Since this unique event corresponds with these unique sounds, we are warranted in seeing a relationship, and this relationship cries out for us to investigate the physical evidence of whatever it is that made those sounds. Fact: molten steel was reported under all 3 collapsed buildings by many eyewitnesses, such as this New York Fire Department captain.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
This debris removal specialist.
The fires got very intense down there, and it actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
This architect.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel.
The incident commander at Ground Zero.
There, this cross is fully extended, melted together with the intense heat. The 2 beams were never initially part of the same structure. Heat literally melted them together.
The director of the New York Department of Design and Construction.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
And even by the structural engineer responsible for the design of the World Trade Center when describing his visit to Ground Zero when he appeared at Stanford University.
We were down at the B1 level, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
These accounts are a sign that the steel did in fact melt. The melting point of that steel was about 1500 degrees Celsius. The melting point of iron is relatively close to that. The melting point of, say, molybdenum is 2617 degrees Celsius. The National Institute of Standards and Technology estimates that the highest temperature ever reached by the fires in those towers was 1000 degrees Celsius. Fact: the United States Geological Survey cataloged iron-rich microspheres all throughout the dust. Since iron only takes the form of these spherules after reaching conditions hot enough in which iron melts and violent enough in which it scatters, And since those temperatures could not have been achieved by the World Trade Center fires alone, this discovery is a sign that other incendiaries must have been present. While there was local scene contamination by cutting torches used at Ground Zero after the collapses, many of these spheres were discovered several blocks away from Ground Zero.
Using a scanning electron microscope, Professor Jones is able to produce high-resolution images of the spheres in the 9/11 dust. And he was given one sample from Brooklyn Bridge, found within an hour of the collapse of the Twin Towers.
Since iron microspheres are not likely to be wandering around New York, it's very unlikely that they are the result of scene contamination after the collapses, and therefore they must have been created by sufficient temperatures before the collapses. Fact: the USGS had also cataloged a molybdenum-rich sphere roll. Since its melting point cannot have been achieved by those fires alone, this discovery is another sign that other incendiaries must have been present. Fact: this particular piece of steel was retrieved from the rubble and described by Worcester Polytechnic Institute's journal as thinned to almost razor sharpness with gaping holes. The journal continues with, "The Swiss cheese appearance shocked all of the Firewise professors who expected to see distortion and bending, but not holes."
It was a surprise to me because it was so eroded and deformed.
This professor's surprise is a sign that such a formation should not be expected within the official narrative. But since it is naturally formed in the use of thermite, it may be seen as a sign that this steel was formed by the use of thermite.
And so we took it for analysis in the lab.
When we did the analysis, we actually identified it as a liquid containing iron, sulfur, and oxygen.
Appendix C of FEMA's report recommended an investigation into the source of the sulfur. It was suggested that the eutectic formations were caused by the sulfur content of gypsum. This was also repeated by the BBC.
The claims of the mysterious melted steel from Tower 7 has been unravelled. The sulfur came from masses of gypsum wallboard that was pulverized and burnt in the fires.
Since even this suggestion appears to have been experimentally refuted, and apparently even admitted as a refutation by the same chemist who suggested it, by elimination, we are warranted in considering the demolition hypothesis. Since iron, sulfur, and oxygen is exactly the chemical composition of a certain type of thermite known as thermate, this is a sign that the steel carried the chemical fingerprint of thermate. Fact: 7 minutes before the South Tower's collapse, glowing metal may be seen pouring from its northeast corner. While NIST had speculated in an August 2006 fact sheet that it must have been the molten airplane aluminum mixed with organic materials, unbiased observation would recognize it as appearing more like molten iron or steel. Experiments, including attempted refutations, have come to establish further the fact that it does not resemble molten aluminum, and that 1. Molten aluminum is apparently silver in color when it is flowing. 2. Molten aluminum is only yellow-orange in color when not flowing, but turns silver again when flowing. And 3. Molten aluminum does not combine with organics. Since this flowing metal positively resembles molten iron or steel, this is a sign that the temperatures in this corner of the building were, at some point, high enough to melt this iron or steel. Fact: these bilayer chips were discovered in the dust samples retrieved from Ground Zero, as well as several blocks away. While it has been suggested that they might just be flecks of paint,
Glad to address that. You're right, they're not made in a cave in Afghanistan. They're made in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania by the Pittsburgh Paint Company. They're made in Kansas City, Missouri by the Tnemec Paint Company.
since they neither resemble nor react like paint, this explanation appears to be false. It has also been suggested that these bilayer chips might have been the natural result of collisions between parts of the building during the collapses. Since they are described as
made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical,
any natural formation would defy the law of entropy and is therefore not a good explanation for it.
I would say that anybody who thinks that should get some, should look at them, should analyze them, and come to their own conclusions after actually doing some work. It's in a silica-based matrix. The real key ingredient is the nano-aluminum. It's a controlled substance. It's very, very difficult to produce in these sizes and to keep from reacting. This was, a massive engineering operation that made these materials. And I would confirm that this material is thermitic and it shouldn't be there.
Since after using 4 different methods of analysis on 4 different samples from 4 different locations, these scientists have concluded that they are a highly energetic, iron-rich microsphere-producing, unreacted thermitic material, this is a sign that maybe they are. Fact. In April 2010, Environmental Health Perspectives reports in a case study of first responders at Ground Zero that carbon nanotubes were discovered in their lungs. Since carbon nanotubes are another natural byproduct of a nanothermate reaction, this may be seen as another sign that nanothermate was present at Ground Zero. Fact.
These thermal images from a NASA flyover taken on September 16th confirm very high temperatures, even under Building 7. Since Building 7 was not hit by an airplane, its hotspots were not being fueled by jet fuel, and therefore something else must have fueled its hotspots. Despite all the firefighting efforts, fires continued 99 days.
These continuing fires and temperatures may be a sign of ongoing chemical reactions in the rubble, continuing to ignite fires even as late as 99 days after the event. Fact. A firefighter radioed his dispatcher that he had reached the 78th floor of the South Tower, where there were, quote, 2 isolated pockets of fire.
Hey, 9415. We got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Where you go that? 78th floor, numerous 1045 cold horns. What stair you in? South Stairway, Adam. South Tower. 478. That's all. I got any 3 firefighters. Adam, stairway to knock down 2 fires. You got a house fire stretch. We can hit some water on it, knock it down, okay? All right, 10-4, we're coming up with Ken. We're on 77 now in the beach scale. I'll be right to you.
Assuming that he understood the nature of the fires, this is also a sign of much smaller fires than would have been required to make the floors sag, as claimed by NIST.
The trusses stayed connected to the columns, even as they sagged from the heat.
Fact. Shortly before the collapse, this waving woman and this man can both be seen standing in the impact zone. Since they are both still alive and standing with pants unsinged, this is a sign that the fires at their level in the building, in addition to not burning long enough, were not achieving temperatures hot enough to make the steel floors sag. In other words, if there was floor sagging present, it was not caused by the fire temperatures present, as claimed by NIST. These 2 signs are further instructive in that since the iron microspheres were discovered dispersed throughout all the dust, including samples taken several blocks away from Ground Zero, if they were to have been created by the fires, the official narrative does not seem to provide an opportunity for their creation outside this moment, and by elimination we are further warranted in considering the demolition hypothesis. Since the official narrative provided by these agencies claims that no other incendiaries were used, it appears that the official narrative has not yet actually claimed the majority of these observed facts. By comparison, if these buildings were brought down by thermate, it could explain both the unique chips discovered in the dust, as well as the source of the sulfur, which must have been present and in sufficient quantities to cause the eutectic formation of this steel, while leaving on it traces of itself, being composed of iron, sulfur, and oxygen, lowering the melting point of molybdenum and scattering as natural byproducts both the carbon nanotubes discovered in first responders' lungs and all of the iron microspheres, some of which we can even observe during its 2,500 plus degree reaction, after some of it appears to have accidentally been ignited by this corner fire due to the airplane bulldozing the office furnishings there, and some of which may have continued sporadically reacting in the rubble pile days and weeks after the event, thus maintaining temperatures sufficient for the molten steel deep in the rubble, which was repeatedly evidenced with eyewitness reports and possibly thermal images, all only after leaving the other previously existing fires small enough to have been potentially extinguished with only 2 lines, and therefore these victims, who obviously had not suffered from the official narrative's required extreme fires, might have been saved from first-degree murder. This interpretation can be rejected if you don't like it, but the facts cannot be rejected.